Welcome to Fast Talk, the Velo News podcast and everything you need to know to ride like a pro.
But in the meantime, but heart rate is a truly physiological parameter, and not using that to monitor an athlete is probably not a good idea.
Welcome to Fast Talk, the Velo News Performance Podcast. Across from me is Senior Editor Caley, Fretz, and as always, I'm Trevor Connor, your Velo News coach. Today we'll do our first in a series of cycling mythbusters. Our topic for this one is whether you still need a heart rate monitor if you own a power meter. You just heard the opinion of our guest today, Dr. Iñigo San Millán, who is the head of the CU Sports Medicine Performance Center. Iñigo has worked with many of the world's top cyclists over the years. He's going to explain to us not only why a heart rate strap isn't outdated, but why it provides valuable information that watts don't tell you. But ultimately, it's a comparison of the two that gets you the most valuable information. Helping us along the way will include interviews with Pro Tour athlete Swain Tuff, professional cyclocross rider Elle Anderson, and talk with a group of domestic pros over dinner. Let's make you fast. So Dr. San Millán, we were going to do a quick intro on who you are, but you have such a long list in your resume. How about we ask you, tell us a little bit about your background with cycling and where you're working right now.
Well, thank you for having me here today. I've been working in cycling for about 20 years, and I've been also, before I was a cyclist myself, and I've been working with different teams and trying to come up with new methodologies for physiological testing, biomarkers for overtraining, fatigue, nutrition, and trying to be providing as much information about how the body works and how the body can improve and how the body can recover and get better.
I know a lot of your research has been on lactate kinetics and heart rate response, so it seems like today's topic is right up your alley.
So let's start sort of with the basics and from 10,000 feet, or look from 10,000 feet. What makes a power meter so good to begin with? Because it is obviously sort of the preferred training tool, at least seems to be the preferred training tool for most cyclists at this point, particularly pro athletes. They're always talking about power numbers. You very rarely hear anyone talking about heart rate. What makes a power meter so powerful, first of all?
Well, so the one thing that I like about power, and I think why it's so appealing to people, is it actually gives you a point of comparison. So if you have two athletes go up a climb and one says, oh, I did it at 168 beats per minute, and the other one says I did 174, it doesn't really mean anything in terms of a comparison, but one says I climbed it at 300 watts, the other one says I climbed it at 400 watts. You do have more of a direct comparison. At the end of the day, we're competitive people, so you want those comparisons. And it does, even as a coach, it gives a great value because 300 watts is 300 watts. You get to see an absolute value in terms of how strong an athlete is. Dr. San Millán, how do you feel?
Yeah, I agree 100% with Trevor, and that's a great way to compare, performance, and it also is a great tool to address progress, right? So, for example, you know that you go up that climb, and last year you were at 325, and this year you're at 365. Right, so that's a great improvement in performance, right? And something that, or a decrease in performance, right? You're lowered 50 watts less, like something is wrong, right? Whereas that you cannot see that with heart rate, right? And it also is a good way to, just for coaches, right, to be able to keep track of the performance of their athletes. I would add something that we saw like a very long time ago. So, for example, during the time trial, right? People usually go at lactate threshold. That's kind of where you're close to where you want to be, right? So people would come to the laboratory to establish their lactate threshold in heart rate. We didn't have the power meters before, or almost nobody used them. So people would take that to the race, right? And they would go at the lactate threshold, let's say 170 to 175, and they would be almost dead last, right? And like, man, it felt too easy, but my heart rate was out there. So we were starting to scratch our heads, like, what in the world went wrong, And that's when we started to realize that there's the catecholamines, right? The catecholamines, when someone is in tension and nervous, especially for a time trial that is short, the heart rate is much higher. like all of us, when we're nervous or in tension, our heart is 15, 20 beats per minute higher. So that was the big interference, So those 170, 175 actually meant 160 or 165. So people would go much slower. So for a few years, people were trying to figure out how we can have a method of perceived effort, right? As opposed to just going by the heart rate until, the power meters came along. And that's where people know quite well, this is for 30 kilometers, or for 10 or for 20, this is the sustainable power output they can afford. So it's a great weapon, right, to assess, to monitor yourself in the competition.
And it's worth noting as well that power meters are cheaper than they've ever been. I mean, the sort of the gold standard SRM, those are still quite expensive, but you can now get a power meter that will get you most of the way there for, $500 or so. And that's really, really come down in the last couple of years. I know that pro riders use them a lot for pacing themselves in real time. So, for example, I heard a story from the Giro. This is after talking to Michele Scarponi on the day that Nibali ended up taking a bunch of time back from Kreuzwick. And if you'll remember correctly, Scarponi was up ahead in a breakaway. Nibali caught him. And basically, as he came up behind him, just yelled a number. That was 375. And Scarponi knew that all he had to do was sit at 375, and that was exactly the pace that Nibali wanted to go. And he just did that as long as he possibly could. And when he couldn't do it anymore, pulled off. So power is definitely used in racing as well as in training. It's obviously a very important tool.
I just want to throw that what you said with the Scarponi, and he's got the same thing we did with Herschel, we were just talking about him. So one of the things that we did, one of the things that we were just doing, what is the pace that he could afford, climbing, right? So we did testing up climbs, right? And the famous Roca Cobra outside Girona, and we were looking at the lactate, the heart rate, and the power output. So it was a good educational process, so that rider could know the power output he could afford in a race situation. And that's kind of what we saw also at the Giro when he won. Like, people were attacking and he was maintaining, because he knew that if he goes 10 powers higher or 20, he's going to blow up. And eventually the others didn't know that, and they blew up, right? So that's a good way, as you very well said, for pacing.
Imagine that's similar to like what Bradley Wiggins was doing when he won the Tour de France. I mean, that was very much the same style. Let the little guys go up and down the road all they want. If he knows he can sit at, whatever that wattage is, 450 watts or whatever, he can just keep going and going and going. So obviously power meters are important. We love power meters. There's no reason really not to get one. And I think this is just, this is the myth that we're trying to bust, right? Is that because power is so popular these days, and it has all these uses and can be used in different ways from heart rate, people have sort of left heart rate monitors behind. We're here to explain to you why maybe that's not such a good idea, particularly in your training.
Before we address the question of why using power on its own might not be the best approach, let's see what Pro Tour rider Swain Tuft has to say about it. Swain is a multi-time tour racer and a podium finisher at the Time Trial World Championships. So if there was anyone who would place a big value on power, it's Swain. Let's hear why he has a different take.
Yeah, unfortunately, our lives have all become bombarded with this power output, and there's not a lot of guys that can go by feel anymore. No. It's especially apparent when you're doing a team time trial. Guys will live and die by the SRM or whatever your chosen device is, and yeah. I think it can be very detrimental to base everything we do off of this set number that we did in some physiology lab, and I really believe that these things are important and they are definitely a huge help in what we do, but at the same time they really disconnect you from the reality of where you might be at that given moment. And it's more important to understand your body and understand where you're at that moment than to try and live up to some impossible expectation on yourself. And like I said, it's very fresh in my mind because of team time trialing and all the work we've done in the last little while. And I see young guys just trying to push this incredible number that they all believe is necessary to win the World Championships, but it's not sustainable. Right. And so that's where I think a lot of times these things, when you don't understand your body and you don't understand what's working behind the scenes there, you really run into trouble. And yeah, I've seen it many times. So for myself, it's more about understanding where you are at that moment and what you are actually capable of. So in the case of like, we have to ride the front full to bring a brake back. Okay, I'll have a look at the power here and there, but really I'm going by a feeling that I know I can sustain for, if it's necessary, I might have to chase for 20K. If I have to ride for 50K, it's a totally different feeling. And that's just lucky from years of experience. I see so many guys trying to, in a time trial or whatever, trying to hold this power output, and it's never really the case. It's never really how it's done. And a time trial is all about picking your battles and understanding the course and yourself. So yeah, numbers are great, but they don't win all the bike races.
So Dr. San Millán, why do we throw that at you? Is a heart rate monitor just outdated technology? Is a power meter a better tool, or is there something that you get from heart rate that you don't get from power?
In a nutshell, why should I continue to wear that heart rate strap when I head out on a training ride?
Well, I would like to ask by another question. So I would ask if we were to ask like what if there was a device, right, that they could measure your physiological parameters during exercise, right? Because at the end of the day, power output is the end product, right? The ability of humans to create energy, right, depends on the ability to transform chemical energy into mechanical energy, right? The power output is the end product, right? But imagine that there's a way we can monitor, right, the physiological responses to exercise in real time. It would be a great breakthrough, right? And a lot of people will buy these devices. Well, heart rate is a truly physiological parameter. In fact, is the only physiological parameter that we can measure in real time at this point. I'm very sure with this innovation of the biosensors, right, coming out, where we in a few years we should be able to measure lactate levels, right, representing the cellular metabolism during exercise. That's going to be a game changer in 10 years or less. But in the meantime, but heart rate is a truly physiological parameter, and not using that to monitor an athlete is probably not a good idea.
So as a coach, one of the things I love to say to my athletes when they ask me, why do you want me to put a heart rate strap back on, is I say, power is a measure of what's going on the bike. Heart rate is a measure of what's going on in the athlete. And at the end of the day, we're trying to train the athlete. What's going on in the bike is going to determine whether you win a race or not. But we're not trying to train the bike. We're trying to train the physiology, and we need to see what's going on with the physiology. And well, you can say going up a climb at 350 watts is impressive. What we don't know is that 350 watts sustainable? Is that your threshold? Is that above threshold? Is that well below? It doesn't give us that information, and heart rate does. But as I remember from the research, to determine your thresholds, lactate is one of the best measures. You get you in a lab, take those lactate values, and you can identify exactly where somebody's lactate is. But as I remember, heart rate and lactate correlate very well, do they not?
Exactly, and this is one of the studies that I have where I was just wanted to challenge the whole question that watts are watts, right? Because people say watts are watts, right? So what you can change, and then obviously speed too, right? So I wanted to see if the power output corresponds to what happens in the body, right? So for that, I put two different groups, right, at different power outputs, and we'll observe, right, at the same power output, I would observe what happened in the body, right, looking at different parameters. So I would look at lactate metabolism. I would look at also VO2, right, as well. And I would clearly see that over time, these two power outputs, which are a little higher too, one was 70% of maximum power output, the other one was 75%, but clearly the body cannot sustain, that homeostasis, right? So you would start at the same power output at, let's say, 3 millimoles, right? And 20 minutes later, you would be maybe at 8 millimoles of lactate, right? Or you would start at 65% of your VO2 max, and 20 minutes later, you were at 90% of your VO2 max. So that clearly tells us that watts are not watts internally in the body, right? And that's something that one of the other parameter that I threw there was heart rate, right? And heart rate and lactate, they correlate together, they go along. Right. And in fact, because heart rate is a truly physiological parameter. So if lactate goes up as a result of metabolic stress, obviously heart rate would go up as well. So that's why you can correlate in a much better way what happens in the body, right, with heart rate than with power output alone.
So this actually gives a really good example of both the danger of only training by power and actually the advantages of having both. So I often have my athletes go out and do very long rides. And whenever I prescribe those, I tell them to do it by heart rate, not power. Because the danger of doing it by power is if you say go out and do a ride at, say, 180 watts, at the start of the ride, that might be what people would typically call a zone 2 ride. But as you said, that heart rate's going to keep going up and up and up. And by the fourth hour, that might be pretty close to threshold if they're trying to just hold the 180 watts. So since we're trying to get a physiological response, I think it's better to prescribe those long rides by heart rate, because if you say do this at 135 beats per minute, 135 beats per minute is still sets you in a particular physiological range. Now, where the power of having both comes in is if I told an athlete to go out and do a 4-hour ride at 135 beats per minute, and their power drops 70 watts over the course of that ride, then you say, you don't have a lot of sustainability. We really need to work on that. Where if you took a pro tour rider and say, do that, probably their power would drop maybe 10 watts over the course of that ride. And you see a side of their training that often doesn't show up on something like Strava and doesn't show up at all if you only have a power meter. What I'm getting at there is something called cardiac drift. And Dr. San Millán, did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And many times, right, people throw that, right, and say, hey, yeah, but the heart rate it just increases because of the cardiac drift, right? I mean, from what I've seen both in the laboratory and the real situations, the cardiac drift is not very big at all. You might have 5-10 beats per minute at the most under normal physiological circumstances. And that's when we prescribe the training to heart rate, we give a bandwidth of about 10 beats per minute, right? But if you have a very high increase in heart rate, could be, as you were said, the power output is not sustainable, or it might represent dehydration, because when the athlete is very dehydrated, right, therefore, the heart rate increases a lot. It's a big cardiac drift, which is excellent information, because it's telling you that you probably are dehydrated. That is, imagine that you always do your workout, and your average, let's say it's 175 watts, for example, and it usually goes along with heart rate, right? So the heart rate's pretty good, but today, whatever, oh my gosh, I'm 20 beats per minute higher, and it's a hot day like outside today. That's great information, because it's telling you that probably you're getting dehydrated. Otherwise, if you don't use the heart rate, you're missing that information, and you're going to get dehydrated. You might pay for that for tomorrow and the rest of the week too.
So is it accurate to say that the best use is heart rate in combination with a power meter?
I agree. I think that it's the combination of both is the great parameters. On one hand, you have, as Trevor very well said, what happens in the body of the athlete, the heart rate, and then you see through the power output what happens on the bike, what's the end product, right? I agree that is the best combination. And I have to say, too, that it was refreshing when to hear from Uli Schroeder, right? He invented power meters, right? And it was like it's not anymore, but it was like a few years ago, it was like heated debate, right? The power output, it's old school, the heart rate. And it was very refreshing to hear from Uli and say, hey, I am the first one who says that you need to use heart rate as well. There's no question the heart rate is a physiological parameter, but the combination of both. So it was very refreshing to hear from the inventor.
We caught up with Elle Anderson, a top 5 finisher in World Cup cyclocross races, who had some thoughts to share with us about using power and heart rate in combination. She also reminds us not to get so caught up in either data that we forget to monitor how we're feeling.
So yeah, and I think that in my training, obviously I use my power zones to do my intervals, but I'm always looking at, when I'm training on the road, on the pavement, but I'm always looking at heart rate to sort of gauge that perceived effort. So even if I know that for 10 minutes I'm trying to hit threshold power, I'm going to be also looking at my heart rate to see how my heart rate compares to what I expect it to be for that effort. So if it feels really hard to keep that threshold power and I see that my heart rate's kind of low, that to me means that I'm tired, and it helps me kind of know whether to back off or to keep pushing.
Right. So you mentioned that in your email, that it's the comparison of the two that you find really valuable. That where's your heart rate relative to the wattage? What else do you see when you compare the two?
I mean, I think in most cases, if I'm just training and I have both my power and my heart rate connected, I'm definitely going to look at both. Like if it's a recovery ride, I'll look at, I want to keep my watts within a recovery zone, but I also want to look at how my heart rate's responding to that power zone. If I'm doing an interval, I'm going to, have instructions from my coach to be within a certain power interval, but I'm going to look at my heart rate to sort of interpret that effort. So the third factor in there is that perceived effort. Because we all, if you just took all numbers away, you'd be able to say, wow, I feel really tired today, or wow, I feel amazing, or anything in between. So it always kind of starts with this, how you feel without the numbers, and then I kind of layer on top what my power says and then what my heart rate says. So I think the primary reason that I'm assessing my heart rate is to sort of compare based on how my perceived feeling is and how the power to sort of bridge that gap in between.
Elle mentioned the value of comparing heart rate and power to see if you're fatigued, which is possibly one of the best uses of the two tools.
Which is the other topic. We can talk about overtraining because that's the other thing about heart rate too.
So that's actually what I was going to ask you, because that's another place where having both power and heart rate is really valuable that, again, you can't see from a power meter. Because I know once you start overtraining, your heart rate response really changes relative to your power. And did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So that's what we see a lot. How many times we have heard about athletes, right, saying my heart rate doesn't go up, right? It's just, I can't get it up. I don't know. I try. That's a sign of fatigue, right? And overtraining. And that's a great information that you miss, So if you don't use the heart rate for that, it's a big information. Now you're going to finish your workout at, let's say, 200 watts as your coach has prescribed. But what's the price that you pay for it, right? And that's very typical. We can talk about the mechanisms of why that could happen, or it might be too much.
Absolutely. So let me start that actually with a story that I love. Something a lot of people don't know about your heart rate is they've actually done these studies on animals where if you disconnect the nervous system from the heart but keep the heart beating, it will beat basically at almost exactly 100 beats per minute. And it's our neurological system that slows the heart rate down when you're at rest and speeds it up when you're exercising. When you start to overtrain, your neurological system gets fatigued. So what you see is a rise in that resting heart rate, but you actually see your max heart rate come down. So it starts approaching that 100 beats per minute. And you see that response out on the road. Do you want to? I'm sure you can take that much further.
No, I think that's exactly. That makes totally sense. I think that there's also another component, which is more the substrate component, right? So when an athlete is fatigued, could be for many different reasons. But one of the typical things that we see, there's not much glycogen content, right, in the muscles. So we know very well, and this is recent research, that glycogen controls muscle contraction because it controls the calcium release and uptake from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is in the muscles, and it controls directly the contraction. So just a 25% decrease in glycogen content in the muscles can represent a decrease of 10% decrease of calcium release. So therefore, that contraction is going to be highly impaired, right? And that's kind of what we see. I developed a methodology where we can look at glycogen content in a non-invasive way with ultrasound, and we see clearly that many athletes, they without depleting glycogen, they might only deplete 30%, 40%. Therefore, they're not bunking, or they have plenty of glycogen, but performance goes way down, right? And that's probably because of these mechanisms we're talking about. But one thing that happens is there's a protective mechanism probably at the brain too. The brain can only use glucose, right? And that glucose comes from the liver, right? Mainly. So, and it can even come at some point from the glycogen from the muscles, right? So when the brain detects low glycogen content, right, it starts getting into more defensive mode, right? And there's some mechanisms where it's telling the liver and the muscles, hey, don't shut down glycogen breakdown into glucose, because glycogen, you have to break it down into glucose for energy purposes. Don't shut it down because you kill me, but please save something, right? So I can think and I can work, and so slow down the breakdown, right? So the mechanisms for that is the catecholamines. Catecholamines are responsible for the breakdown of glycogen into glucose, right? So there's a decrease in catecholamine activation, right? And guess what's the collateral effect of catecholamines? They also activate the heart. So, so the maximum or the higher rate, they get decreased. So when you're seeing that there's low heart rate, the heart rate can get up, which is very typical. It happens, as you all said, it's a neurological response, but could also be, and it's part of the whole neurological response, like a lack of substrate.
Just to make sure that I understand exactly what you're saying. So essentially your brain, in order to sort of save itself, will suppress heart rate once you're glycogen deficient, even if you're not totally, bonking or anything like that. So heart rate, I guess, back to our original question, would be an important indicator that what you need more recovery, or you just need to fuel better, or what exactly is it telling us then? The suppressed heart rate.
So in this situation, that you're fatigued and recovered, and if you ever feel that situation where you are out there and your heart rate doesn't get up and you struggle, the watts are the same, right? So you pay a big price because the effort is much higher, right? So you keep digging the hole. Probably that's one of the things that we saw. When people were so into the power output at first, we saw a lot of people getting overtrained because exactly these situations. They didn't have the heart rate monitor anymore. Whereas if you go through that situation and you see that, oh my gosh, my heart rate doesn't go up, if you call the day, go home, recover, eat well, and carbo load normally, the next day you're going to feel like $1 million. It's going to be a big day, big change. And that's what a lot of people report. So that's something that if you don't have the heart rate, you miss out completely.
Another similar mechanism to this is anybody who lives at sea level, if they go up to altitude and watch their heart rate, you're going to see something similar where because you can't get as much oxygen to your muscles and to your brain, you get that limiter. And what you'll often find is your max heart rate comes down at altitude. You just can't hit the same heart rates. There's certainly no question that Dr. San Millán knows what he's talking about. But an equally important question is whether this knowledge about heart rate and power is filtering down to the riders who need to use it. To see if pros still use heart rate, I sat down with a few at the post-race party for the Reading 120, the last big pro race of the domestic calendar.
Okay, so we're going, and here's the question. If you have a power meter, is there a reason to still have a heart rate monitor? Do you guys use one? Do you use both? Why? Which one do you use?
My name's Noah Granigan, and I use a heart rate monitor along with my power meter because I feel like power meter shows you the numbers that you're doing and just how hard you're going, but the heart rate monitor really shows how your body is responding to the given effort. So I think they work pretty well together in that way.
What do you guys think? Is he full of it, or is there something to that?
No, I agree. My name is Kai Wiggins, and I use both power and heart rate, albeit sporadically. And I think it's a good idea to be more in tune with what's going on inside your body and to gauge your efforts in the context of what's going on inside your body. So
that was good. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And of course, talking with pros at a race begs a question. What about heart rate and power in a race?
I would say one thing that we see in the competition, it's very typical at the pro level, especially, and even at the amateur level, that someone starts a stage race, the first race, and they hit their maximum heart rate, let's say 195, and the last stage or the last two stages, the maximum heart rate is 170, 175, right? This is very, very, very typical, and that's something that you can monitor the adaptation of the race of that cyclist, right? The power output, definitely you can see that maybe they're not hitting that, but you can see there's probably a fatigue component as well. It's dangerous though, because if you give that information to the cyclist and in the competition they're using the heart rate and say, oh my gosh, you're not going out, I'm done, So it's psychologically, it's double-edged sword.
So would you recommend that athletes keep an eye on heart rate and power while they're racing? Or is this something that, if they're working with a coach, they should primarily just sort of send to the coach at the end of the day and say, hey, how am I doing? What do you recommend? Or is this something that they can kind of keep an eye on in real time?
I think it's very individual, right? But it takes a lot of experience. The other thing that, for example, that happened with the power output in the race situation, that let's say you go to a race, and you know that you're training for the race that's going to end up in that climb, right? So you go training in that climb, and you know you can put out 350 watts for the entire climb, right? Therefore, in your mind, it goes, okay, the day of the race, I'm going to put out 350 watts. So you hit that climb at the end of the race, and you try to 350 and you blow up. Because it's a big difference in how you get to that climb on a training session or in a race situation where you cannot put out more than 335 watts. So that's why it's important also to be able to play with that the power up, if you just religious, you go by it, it can be a double, edged sword too.
So I got to put you on the spot, continuing with that. I'm going to give you a scenario. You have an athlete that you're coaching who's a contender for the World Championships in the time trial. They're on their way to the time trial. They call you, and for whatever reason, they say, okay, I can either use a power meter or a heart rate strap, but I can't use both. Which one should I use?
For a time trial situation, for me, without a doubt, I will use the power output. Because what I said earlier, that the heart rate is going to be in such intense effort, is going to be 15-20 beats per minute higher than normal. It's not physiological then. It's a big artifact, but it's the power output, So I would definitely use the power output for those situations. It's more for like training, right? And as you very well said, for those like lower intensity, zone 2, zone 3, that's where the heart rate is it's probably more appropriate. But also keeping the monitoring of the power output.
So what other difference between power and heart rate that you see is actually a consistency through the season that can become really valuable? So meaning if you went into Dr. San Millán and got tested in January, and let's say he said, okay, your threshold heart rate is 171, your threshold power is 280. What you'll see over the course of the season is as your fitness goes up and down, 280 will not stay your threshold wattage. It might at some point go up to 320. It might come down to 260 at some point. But that heart rate that he gave you, you will know that's always going to, at least for that year, that's going to be your threshold heart rate. So you could always make sure with heart rate that as your fitness improves, you're still training in the right zones.
So that's about 20 minutes on attempting to convince our listeners that they should go out and buy a heart rate strap maybe for the first time in a couple of years. If they're going to do that, and if they're going to start training and racing with heart rate as well as their power meter, what should they be doing with those two devices, and how can they get the most out of them?
Let's start with a couple tips from Elle.
Kind of the advice that it's really helpful to do a little research on what your heart rate zones are. I know things, I'm not super expert, but I kind of know approximately what my heart rate is at the lactic threshold. Mm-hmm. So that's helpful for me. I kind of have that number in mind to know when I cross that line. And, I think it's just helpful to, things like Strava can help you kind of estimate those zones, but I think there's other ways that you can really kind of get to know what your heart rate zones are a bit better. Without kind of knowing about yourself personally and about how your heart beats, it's kind of hard to utilize a heart rate monitor to, the maximum extent.
So when you're training, and let's say you're doing intervals, you're out doing a long, steady ride, are there some times where you're more likely to use power to train by? Sometimes you're more likely to use heart rate, or are there times where you don't want to use either?
Power meter responds in such real time to those changes in effort, but you're going to see your heart rate respond slower. The minute you start that 30-second interval, your heart rate's going to take a few seconds to ramp up to a higher rate, and then obviously when you stop the interval, it's going to take a few seconds to recover. So it's a bit of a different indicator than your power meter, but over that longer distance interval, you're going to be able to see your heart rate pinned to a more consistent rate for the entire duration. And I'll definitely look at that, as a complement to where my power is. I find heart rate to be much more helpful in my cross races than looking at a power meter. Because especially with cyclocross, it's also hard because your power is pretty inconsistent.
I was about to say,
So
you're either doing 500 watts or zero, right?
Right. I mean, you're going to have moments in a cross race where you're not pedaling because you're going around corners, or you're not even pedaling because you're running over barriers.
Right.
That's even extra challenging.
So one of the first suggestions I'm going to make that's not very glamorous but actually really important is use heart rate as a bit of a default guide. Meaning, so I'll give you a quick story. I started coaching an athlete this winter who only went by power. And I had him doing these threshold intervals. And 1 week he did them on a trainer. The other week he did them on his own bike. And the difference in those two power meters was extreme. So he contacted me. He's like, I don't get it. When I did it the 1 week, they were incredibly easy. When I did it the other week, they were incredibly hard. I asked him to send me his files. And even though they were at the same power, the 1 week his average heart rate was about 150. The other week his average heart rate was 175. And I said, you didn't notice this? He goes, I don't look at heart rate. I went, well, the calibration was completely different. You were actually doing very, very different intervals. So when you have that heart rate and you know your threshold heart rate, then you can identify, okay, my heart rate's at 175 and the power meter says I'm doing 150 watts. You know that something's up with the power meter.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. And it's something that happens all the time. People come to our laboratory and our machines are more accurate than the average power meter. So they get different parameters, then go on the power meter, and the power meter is different, and then they have the trainers and the same thing, whereas the heart rate doesn't change. It doesn't matter if you do it in the laboratory and you trainer outside, right? So that's where it's more reliable because it's your own body. As you said very well, Trevor, at the beginning, the heart rate tells you what's going on in your body, and the power output, what happens in your bike.
So what are suggestions to athletes in terms of training? When is it better to use heart rate? When is it better to use power?
I think that heart rate, it's as you said, is like the default, right? It could be for lower intensity base aerobic training, like the zone 2, and that's where you can also see your power output. I think that for the competition and for higher intensities, right? I think the power output is a more reliable tool, maybe, but you also want to see what's your heart rate response.
Right. Agree with you there completely. If you're doing minute intervals or 20-second intervals, heart rate takes time to respond, so you're not going to see anything with heart rate. You have to look at power at that point. Mm-hmm. So if you're doing 20-second intervals, you're probably not looking at either. You've just seen a lot of red.
Yeah.
So what are suggestions to athletes if they go out for a ride, they're not feeling great, and they look down and they're doing 200 watts and their heart rate's 10 beats per minute lower than what they would normally see?
So that's a great point, and that's what heart rate is of tremendous information in those days, because that's where you know very well that usually at that power output you normally are let's say 150 beats per minute, and today you're struggling to maintain the power output and your heart doesn't go above 130. So without a doubt you're tired and your heart rate is telling you. So the best that's a great way to call the day. Go home and recover. Whether if you didn't have that heart rate information, you would continue pushing it and you will pay for that.
So the flip side of that, what if they go out, they're doing 200 watts and their heart rate's 10 beats per minute above what they would normally see? What would that mean? Mm-hmm.
So that could be that maybe there's a dehydration process there. So it's great information too. Sometimes when also could mean that when the body is going through an infectious process, incubating, even in the incubating phase already happening, the heart rate is going to be elevated, So that's another information to be alert that something is going on. If it's very cold outside and your heart rate is 10, 15 beats per minute higher, obviously you're not dehydrated, but something might be going on in your body, right? So that's why it's a physiological parameter. Heart rate responds to what happens in the body.
Fantastic.
Real quick follow-up question to that. So we're talking about, at a given power, your heart rate being 10 beats high or 10 beats low. What's the window of sort of normal variance in heart rate? I mean, at what point do you have to be worried, or what point do you have to go home? Is it 10 beats? Is it 15 beats? How much different does it need to be from normal before you just call it a day?
So you take this one?
Well, we can go, but yeah.
Well, so I will start my answer to this with back when I was training full time. What I used to do was go out for a ride, and about 20 minutes into the ride, I would do exactly that. I would set myself at 200 watts and look at my heart rate response. But I would look at other factors. I generally had about a 5 beat above or below tolerance where I just went, okay, that's just normal day-to-day variance. Once I started seeing over or below that, then I started asking myself questions like, how do I feel? And if I felt like I was struggling, if something felt off, then yeah, I would say, okay, time to turn around and go home. Would you agree with that, or would you?
I agree. I think I agree, and I think that that small window that is not super high, it's very safe, and I agree. So I mean, and the other thing that it's important is like, as all this technology is going to be advancing, right? We will have, in a matter of years, right, more accurate information, that we can monitor what happens in the body, especially with all those biosensors. So we will get to know your lactate levels, right, in real time. And the lactate is the best parameter to know what happens at the cellular level, at the metabolic level, right? So we can dial in trainings even better at the way we have done before. And that's going to be the next revolution in monitoring training. But in the meantime, we need to find out or we need to use a parameter, right, that we can use on a daily basis, right, that relates to what happens at the cellular level. And again, we always have to remember that heart rate is a truly physiological parameter. It's the only parameter, physiologically speaking, that we can monitor and relates very well to what we see in the laboratory with lactate.
Well, there you have it. You thought you just bought your power meter and that's all you need. Turns out, no. You should also be riding with a heart rate monitor for all of the reasons that we just mentioned. Thank you again, Coach Trevor Connor, as always. Thank you, Iñigo San Millán. We will have Iñigo back on at some point, I hope. He's local to Boulder here. So that is it for Fast Talk, the VeloNews Performance Podcast.